item number C, 9C, presentation and discussion regarding the investigative report on Epic.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, board members, I'll attempt to give a more detailed overview, yes, of the investigative report on Epic Charter Schools. Did release that report, the department did earlier this week, and so it is on the agenda for a presentation and presentation only at this time. Of course, ask any questions, and I will say at the outset, there are a number of representatives from Epic here. Glad they're here, and they can obviously come up and answer any questions you might have for them, make a presentation. Okay.
That'd be good.
Yeah. So the report is based on a complaint. The complaint was filed with the Department of Education, the statewide virtual charter school board, as the sponsor of Epic one-on-one charter schools, and Rose State, who sponsored Epic Blended. And so, to my knowledge, that complaint was filed with those three entities. Complaint, in our minds, as we looked at it, really broke down into three areas. The first was governance, and that's the first chapter in the report. Within that chapter, you'll see information relating to contracting, bidding, awards, Open Meeting Act claims, and the culture and climate at Epic. So that's chapter 1. Second chapter is based on attendance and enrollment. You may have seen some of this information already, but that really relates to two areas in the complaint. First was that the truancy audit conducted by the former internal auditor at Epic. The complaint alleged that information was suppressed, specifically by the superintendent at Epic. As you will see in the report in a few moments, I think, we did not find any evidence of that. In fact, we found that there was an email where the complainant said, I don't think this information should be brought to the board, in essence, and that is in the report, a copy of that email. The second item under attendance and enrollment, the complaint alleged unlawful practices, improper practices, essentially that Epic was withdrawing too many students. And I think, as you may have already seen, and as we will look at, I think the department found the opposite. Students were not being withdrawn as required by law, so they weren't being withdrawn enough. And the third chapter relates to compensation. Excessive bonus payments were given to administrative staff in June of 2021. Those payments exceeded employee agreements or employment agreements, and also violated board policy relating to proration if an employee was not employed the full year. Okay. Before we get into chapters 1, 2, and 3 in more detail, the report jumps in. What jurisdiction does the agency have to even look at this, to receive those complaints? We know that two of those other entities that I mentioned earlier believed that they did not have jurisdiction to investigate at least some of what was in the complaint, specifically with Title IX. The department, as you will see in the report, does have jurisdiction over Title IX. Before getting into that, the statutes and the Constitution say the State Department of Education and the State Board of Education are the agencies in the state of Oklahoma that are charged, have the duty to provide oversight, supervision, govern, and direct public schools in the state. To do that, at least part of it is done through accreditation standards. So the legislature identified a policy in two parts. One, all children should be able to receive an excellent education. And secondly, taxpayer funds should be expended in a most efficient manner. So those two policy statements in statute are to guide the accreditation standards that have been adopted in the state of Oklahoma. And then, as I mentioned, federal regulations also come into play with Title IX. When we talk about governance, you need to understand, and I wish Rebecca was here. She does a fantastic job. Rebecca Budd, as a member of our team, has the experience. She's very thorough, detailed, and I think communicates how a school system, the governance structure should look and operate. So I'll try to do a decent job of that here. On the left are kind of the do's, what you should see for an effective school system, its Board of Education. So the board really determines the what, and then the superintendent and staff go execute that what and the why. The how, if you will. So the board sets the philosophy. They're responsible for the operations, ultimately responsible for the operations and performance. They are to do that setting of the what, largely through policies and procedures. So you should see a thick policies and procedures book to guide the staff in adhering to those policies and procedures. They hire a superintendent who's the CEO by statute. That's the terminology that's used for a superintendent. Superintendent of a school system is the executive officer, the principal, chief administrative officer of the school. The board also, as you saw the last audit, is to approve employment agreements. It's true with charter schools and non-charters. Both of those apply. And then again, this is a little repeat from before. Board is responsible for approving all financial transactions. Administrative regulations that were adopted by the State Board of Education years ago say that a Board of Education, these are the don'ts, Board of Education board members should refrain from involvement in the the day-to-day functions of a school. Regulations specify, this is in the report, a board member is a board member in a board meeting. Outside of that public board meeting, a board member is a citizen of that community. And that is cited in that section. Boards, the members are not to engage in transactions unless the majority of the board members in a public meeting authorize that action. And then finally, board members should not, or let me say it this way, boards should transact business with staff through the superintendent. There's a history section in the report because as the team looked at the allegations, at least in some areas, we saw a repeat of some things that we identified, not just this agency, but other agencies identified in years past. So starting with 2016, you see this here, EPIC was reporting 100% of their students as being in attendance every day of the entire school year. Which was in 2016, it was described as alarming at that time. The reality is there were no laws in place at that period of time that required reporting of attendance, daily reporting of attendance for statewide virtual charter school students. And so when that became known in 2018, Senate Bill 244, still in effect, requires virtual charter schools to adopt attendance policies. But from that point forward, saw better reporting, I think, across the board. 2019, House Bill 1395 was passed. That required a number of things. One, I think most publicly anyway that's been discussed, charter schools that contract with a management company had to report those expenditures to the management company in detail through the Oklahoma cost accounting system, function object code. We should see a lot of detail coming. That did result in the first year with I think it was more than $10 million in assessed penalties to EPIC. The department in that year requested subpoena authority to try to get access to certain records. I don't believe it was actually related to EPIC in that situation. It was a prior investigation where we sent a letter requesting information from a third-party vendor, and the third party said, "Where's your subpoena?" We didn't have it, and so we tried to get that through legislation. I think it's north of 40 agencies that have subpoena power, at least as the last check. 2019, summer of 2019, the investigative audit was requested. That audit request was to have the state auditor and inspector conduct a look back of at least 3 years of EPIC and related entities. That audit has obviously been released in 2020. Following that audit, the statewide virtual board initiated termination proceedings against Epic that would have closed the school, but that did not happen. Those parties settled that case. And so the state board issued a demand to return $11.235 million. That was a result of the state auditor's report. And so you might remember just after that report, I had a special meeting in October of 2020 to demand the return of those funds. Fast forward to last December 2021, you all voted to recoup $9.11 million approximately. And then right around that time is when the complaint landed in the inboxes of those three entities. It was quick. Any questions there? Did miss one. In 2020, there was a recommendation to put Epic on probation at that time. Ultimately, that did not happen, but there was, coming out of that meeting, a directive that the department send correspondence to Epic, identifying to community strategies what those non-compliance items were. And that subsequently happened shortly after that. So in summary, the areas identified for non-compliance at that time, I think in the state auditor's report as well, were that the community strategist board was not approving financial transactions, employee contracts, payments, purchase orders to various entities. The requirements in state law were not being adhered to. Data reporting was not accurate. That's been an issue for some time. So that was identified as well. Said employees without contracts, lack of governance and oversight issues. It's going to play into Chapter 1. So when that correspondence went to Epic Community Strategies in November of 2020, specifically it requested that community strategies assess their governance. Do you have the right individuals in place with particular expertise in areas that you would expect to see on the school board? And so that begins Chapter 1. That contract was awarded to Education Board partners. The allegation with respect to Education Board partners had several allegations, the first of which was really a broad request to look at the contract. Was it properly awarded? We found that it was properly awarded. Epic's policies at the time did not require the competitive bidding. They claimed an exemption, and so they didn't have it in policy. Subsequent amendments to those policies do require competitive bidding. I think that's a wise practice and commend that adoption. We did find, in our opinion, that the contract violates Article 10, Section 26 of the Oklahoma Constitution. That, in general terms, prohibits a public body from expending funds across fiscal years. So you can't incur a debt in year one to obligate in year 2 or 3. And so what we saw was that this contract had a year one, I think it was $75,000. And then in year 2, it would be $50,000. That makes sense. The next allegation was about background checks. The allegation was that Education Board partners was required to conduct background checks as a part of the contract. The contract itself, as we looked at it, says that Education Board partners will provide background information, and then in parentheses that would be candidate bios, resumes. It doesn't say criminal history checks, doesn't say background check. So in our view, in the team's view, that was not a requirement of the contract. Supporting that were interviews with staff. And so we were provided with an email that said EBP, Education Board Partners, is responsible for vetting candidates. We asked the individual or individuals, what did you mean by vetting? And that supported, the response supported what we believed to be true, which was, I didn't mean criminal history checks. I meant just general vetting, resumes, background info on candidates. The one note to make there is that think it was in the last 5 months, Community Strategies has adopted a policy to require board members to undergo criminal history checks.
Community strategy test.
Yes.
Is that common?
No, not in charter schools. I would say it's not common in others as well. Just to clarify that.
It's going above and beyond, really.
It is. I mean, in some sense, candidates for non-charter boards of education are elected, and so there is some, at least, thought that there's vetting that would occur with those individuals. In typical sense, charter board members are appointed; they're not elected. There are no electors in that community, so to speak, and so. You know, they might speak to that better than I can. That's why that was adopted, but it is going above and beyond. It was, yeah, good practice. The turnover audit is the next item in the governance section, I think. The allegation there is kind of similar, that this awarded contract did not comply with board policy to seek bids, obtain bids, and award the contract so you get the lowest and best price, best service. We did find evidence that that allegation was substantiated.
Can I ask, it sounded like in the previous one, you said that it wasn't board policy to seek bids, right? Is this after that policy was put in place?
Yeah, great catch. That's exactly right. There could have been a sole source justification. I don't know if that was the reasoning for that. It may have been. I think in the team's mind, the number of audit firms that exist in the state of Oklahoma would not justify a sole source. There are more than one entity that can perform an audit, but you know, they can speak to that. There are also prior relationships with the firm that was awarded that contract. That contract really never went anywhere. Shortly after the complaint was made public, that entity, I believe, terminated that work, canceled that contract. I'm not even sure that much of the work had already started at that point. But it wasn't the complaint, and so we had to look at it. It's difficult to see, but since the work of Education Board Partners began, we put together a timeline of significant events over the last 18 months. So that work with EBP started in February of 2021, I believe, maybe March. And so you can see a rundown of events, significant events at Community Strategies and EPIC over the last 18 months.
Is there like a corporate org chart that would show like EVP, Community Strategies, EPIC, where EPIC Youth Services fit into this before their agreement was terminated, like kind of the big picture?
Yeah, I might, if I can, reserve that for them to address. I think that's okay. So the next part of the governance was the culture and climate. It's the easiest way I can say it. So the allegation in the complaint was that several women had come to this board member and represented that they were subjected to being berated, yelled at, et cetera, by the board chair. And so that's the culture and climate. We sat down with a number of staff and were provided with information. They shared their experiences, and we can go through that. The first one, there's an image in the report, I believe it's around page 26, 27, of a whiteboard. That was from, I think, a meeting in February of 2022, where at least one, I think two board members attended. Employees described that meeting to us as creating confusion, demonstrating that the board chair was in the weeds, giving directives, micromanaging day-to-day things at the school district. Obviously, those regulations I went through earlier would say, do not do that. And so that was at least one of the reports. The confusion is, according to the employees we talked to, continuing. They don't know if they're supposed to take directives from board members individually or from the superintendent. The
Brad,
white,
can you talk about, as part of this investigation, how many people did you talk to? Like, are you gonna get to that?
I can right now,
Breakdown.
actually. No. So process-wise, that complaint came in December 1, I believe. I think it was December 8th. The department sent a notice of opening the complaint investigation and said, we will be in touch to request records in the near future. I think we sent that letter to in-house counsel at Epic beginning of January, requested certain records. Epic provided responsive documents February 3rd, I believe. The State Department of Education staff reviewed those documents, did not believe that that fully responded to the request. And so we went back and requested additional information, or if there was no information, just tell us the information doesn't exist. So Epic did respond, I think it was April 2nd or 3rd, with a range of other documents. We then looked at those documents, and then at the beginning of May, maybe it was late April, scheduled several days to interview staff. I don't have the numbers, but it was more than 10 staff members that we talked to across various departments, finance, human resources, board members. I believe all but one board member was interviewed.
Was Epic cooperative as far as providing
Very.
staff members and board members and all
Most
that to be interviewed?
Absolutely. Yep.
I have one other question that's kind of a broader question, but when this complaint comes into the state, when any complaint comes into the State Department of Education, what is the process by which you decide which ones you're going to investigate, which ones you don't? I assume you get a lot of complaints. So, from like a December 1, the complaint came in, to December 8, it was already decided that it was going to be investigated. Is that normal? I mean,
Yeah, why
what
this
does
one?
that look like?
Yeah, why this one? So that's really in the jurisdiction section, but yes, it is normal. We look at every complaint that comes in. Do I look at every complaint? Does Rebecca look at every complaint? There's a team here for sure. Accreditation, Ryan Piper, we've recently brought on an investigator. We have one investigator. We've really needed that for a while. Other agencies, licensing bodies have upwards of 16 investigators to look at.
So is it
complaints.
really just whoever gets the complaint down your
No.
team, like decides?
No. So there's all sorts of, I get them. They come in through Facebook Messenger, on your personal thing, on your, any way they find ways to contact. That's how we learned
We get
about
them,
Perry. You get them. The Perry situation where children were being molested and the school didn't believe it. And the parents were reaching out to me directly. And before I go to bed at night, I review it. And when I wake up in the morning, because we can't lose something. And there's a lot to navigate like that. But then there's also those that come into the department. So it could come in from lots of different areas. Usually it involves special education. So if it is involving civil rights of IDEA, of course, that's just an example. Then it will go into that office, and they have a system of how to handle that. The RAOs receive a whole host of different complaints related to specific parent issues with schools, or it could be a lot of times employee issues that we don't have jurisdiction over. It could be Title IX complaints, which triggers a different response. So there's just a wide variety. It could be their PEBT card, which we're into probably hundreds and hundreds. So that's all, there's a process of where they go based on that.
And I guess, and that makes sense. Just then ultimately, I guess it goes to the
Some can
department
be
that it
resolved.
needs.
Some,
And then,
they all usually will, most of them will interact with the school. That here's a complaint that we received, like that's usually the first thing that happens. There's other times where we may have to do a little bit more research to figure out where the child is enrolled, things along those lines, how to connect. can we talk with the person that complained? Are they a custodian? There's all kinds of factors.
For sure. So in some, I think nearly all the time, I'm looking at Ryan Piper. He's my first one to engage, along with, depending on the situation, it may be the counseling, bullying resource department here to reach out to the parent or whoever it is that filed the complaint. That's our first touch with the individual. We want to respond right away.
Yep.
And communicate with them, let them know that we've received it and that we will begin our work.
And some come through law enforcement there's this confidential tip line that triggers, and some of us receive those 24/7. And then that triggers more. So
At Western Heights, emails were coming in. It's no secret, Kingfisher, we responded right away to let them know notice of complaint investigation has been opened. And then we get to work.
that's part of what, that's kind of a daily, many times a day.
Got it.
Coming out of that meeting, as I mentioned, an organizational redesign meeting, an employee made a report to Human Resources complaining, I'm confused, I don't really know who to report to. Board members are giving me directives, or a board member is giving me a directive. But we have a superintendent who I've reported to, I still report to. Who do I respond to? It's that confusion, to be light with it, confusion. Is that right there. Reports to Human Resources, calls to the Department of Education. Our superintendent is being terminated this evening, and they're going to bring in a CEO. What's going on at Epic? Because the whiteboard at that meeting had the CEO phrase there. And then on an agenda for May 11th, community strategies agenda that was posted initially, had the superintendent's name or position on there. And so the employees who were at this leadership meeting connected, CEO is going to be brought in, and our superintendent is going to be removed.
I mean, just trying to look at this objectively, like this looks like any org chart that like the most basic business would have. Like, I don't know like what it looked like before, but like to say that this is a big reorganization, like I question that. And then also, like, is it fair to say that a lot of this that we're hearing is hearsay?
No.
I heard them say this, like.
No, I mean, these people were at the meetings that we interviewed. And to your point, I think it's a good point. It does look like a business structure, which too, it raised eyebrows in the investigation members' review of it, because Epic was just getting rid of a management company.
Right. I mean, CEOs, our superintendents see themselves as the CEO of their schools.
Yeah.
They all have, legal, finance people. I mean, you got principals. I mean, there's.
What page are you on?
I think the difference is
30.
that is not the CEO maybe. Am
sorry?
I misunderstanding?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
So I thought this was attributed not to the superintendent,
No, I'm just saying, like, it could just,
because that would be the proper.
yeah, unless it was.
Yeah. And the report mentions employees at that meeting were told that they could not be trusted. I mean, I don't think you come to staff meetings at the department and engage at that level. I don't think that happens at school
My
districts.
badge only works on board days. Just kidding. That's a joke.
So then the bylaws that have been recently put in place say that if there is a vacancy in the superintendency position, the board chair becomes the interim or permanent superintendent. So all of those lead to confusion. They can be corrected. That's the good news, right?
Right.
And
Do we know how many students they have now? I know they've had several thousand, but how many do they have?
Mr. Banfield, do you happen to know?
What was the October 1st count?
Or, sorry, I don't know. I'm looking at Carol.
Squirrel.
We'll get it. The October 1 count.
Thank you.
And they said what?
Not that it matters, Brad, but it actually says COO at the top. It has CEO down here, so it lists both. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah.
Finally found the pages, page 30.
Thank you. So again, to those who are looking at that, we didn't go out and attend that meeting. These are documents that were given to us, and the employees represented that it looked like a corporate management structure being brought in again.
Can I ask, is the accusation there that that's inappropriate?
Yes.
Okay.
100%, yes. Hostile work environment was used. As we will see in an audio recording that some of the investigation team were able to listen to, the word hostile work environment was used in a conversation with leaders at Epic, including human resources. So it wasn't hearsay. In fact, we were very careful to compare notes and make sure that anything that goes in this report were consistent across everyone. Now, Epic may have a rebuttal or response, certainly respect that, but across the members who reviewed that, there's nothing in the report that wasn't in every single individual's notes. Non-hearsay, to a direct question, multiple staff members, said governance under the current board chair does not provide what the school needs, does not provide the continuity of stability to allow this school to fulfill the needs to the students and families. It's a direct statement.
Is it unusual that people in the school would feel that way about board members? I think a lot of people think that.
I think the point is that I think here's the point. There's a governance structure that's not being observed, that is all across the school districts. The school superintendent is certified. Only one person has that role, and they are the CEO in charge. They've been hired for that role. The board has a different role. They're not running the school. That's the delineation. So just to help kind of framing that, I feel like that piece might be missing in what we're talking about here. It's not the business acumen, the ideas, the ability, for individual to, in some different structure outside of a school board, be successful in managing people. It's not that. It's this structure that is applied across Oklahoma. On this,
You go to lots of schools. You go visit lots of schools.
School boards cannot operate schools.
Yeah, but what's your question, Trent?
I'm just saying, it's not uncommon for school board members to go into their school. I know in Yukon and Norman and schools all across the state, you're involved in things that the school does as a community. I mean, these are,
Of course.
involved. They're talking to employees, they're talking to
Yes,
it's hard to separate in that scenario, I think, an individual from their role as a school board member, because you're
People know
sure.
their role and they listen, they represent their community, receive information. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think that's the point.
Before I forget, Trent, it's a great point. And I think that's why those regulations were put in place as guardrails. So, Mr. Bobek or others go into a school setting, there's, cordiality, there's kindness, exchange back and forth. But when the complaints start coming in that we're seeing a lot of overstepping, that's where those regulations should come in and say, we need to step back and know that, this really isn't our lane. But you're right.
Ask on the slide where you outlined the Board of Education responsibilities. Are these outlined in statute? Like, where does this come from?
That one.
Statute and regulation. And I think the report, I feel very confident this has hyperlinks to all of the statutes. We cannot, at this time, directly link to the regulations and administrative code, but the citations are there. They're from both.
By regulations, you mean rules adopted by this board or
Passed by
regulations?
the legislature into law.
Into law, and then, yes, rules.
So rules from the state board of education.
That's right. So
Adopted and signed. by the
approving
governor.
financial transactions.
I just mean like the regulations came through this board and, you know,
Or
went
are
through
in
that.
statute.
So financial transactions is at Title 70, Section 5-135.2, and also 18-116. Adopt policies and procedures, that's in the Charter Act itself.
So it's all these sites right here on page 8.
Yeah, they're going to be numerous places.
the
throughout
governance.
report, but that's right. Okay, so Title IX, again, had the complaint that said the hostile work environment. Several women have come to me and made these complaints about being yelled at. Title IX is the federal law and regulation that, in a very basic sense, prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. I think today is actually the 50th anniversary of Title IX.
Yes.
So that is the prohibition under Title IX. There are procedural requirements in Title IX, and then there is substantive, if you do this, there's a penalty, and that those are very serious. You've seen throughout the country a lot of those probably in the recent years at universities in particular. Procedural requirements you have to have on your website, information about how to file a complaint, how do you file an anonymous complaint, who's your complaint investigator. You have to have an annual notice that goes out to individuals. We saw this with Ninica and Ulaga, right? So when we looked at EPIC's website at the time, I will say right away that they have corrected these. Okay, so they've done that work. But at the time, when we looked at it, those things they did not have in place on the website. So there is a procedural violation that was determined, included in the report. We did not find a substantive violation. We didn't see any evidence to substantiate the allegation that there was there were no complaints filed with Human Resources. Okay. Staff interviews did reveal that if these things are true, they would, in our opinion, constitute unprofessional behavior.
So, but by no substantive violation, that means that you saw no evidence that those things were true.
Saw no evidence that there was discrimination on the basis of sex. There was no evidence of sexual harassment.
And there was no complaint filed with HR about it.
That is correct. Okay. So those three instances that I'm referring to about if true, say that, because there's one side here and another side there. If true, we would have large concerns with them. First one relates to the internal auditor, former internal auditor. According to that individual, she approached the Human Resources Department, the superintendent and the board chair, I believe, and made mention that bonuses being paid did not comply with what we will get into in Chapter 3. Following that meeting, as we understand it, there was a meeting through, I think it was through Zoom. I'm not sure about that actually. But the team member did have an opportunity to listen to the audio of what he thinks was that conversation. And again, there's another side of it, but the audio itself, which is quoted in the report, at the end, it says that, as an auditor, if you keep trying to play gotcha, these kinds of moments, it's going to be hard for you to do your job. Several weeks later, the internal auditor resigned. Several weeks after that, the entire internal audit department was terminated. The second was a meeting, this one was through Zoom, on April 8th of 2022. It was described to us in an interview with the board chair. as the superintendent contacting education board partners, requesting a meeting to discuss two matters. One included the complaints that had been made. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Is it common for large school districts to have internal auditing departments?
That would be a no.
No, I don't know that it's a no. I don't know if they call them that.
What is that?
Through their finance office. You know, they have individuals that have those capabilities, but I don't think it's common to have an internal audit department. And at Epic, the internal audit position was created as someone to report directly to the board, to community strategies, as a result of the state auditor and investigators report. And I think it was a compliance requirement as a part of that settlement with the statewide virtual charter school board.
So you said that the internal audit team, I may not be getting perfect, but was let go.
Right.
Was a new team hired?
I don't believe so.
Have they been replaced?
No.
Okay.
But can I ask, it sounds like the reason that was put in place was because in response to the state auditor's audit.
That is correct.
So it wasn't something that was required.
No.
Right, but they did it voluntarily.
That's right. At this meeting, the board chair described to us, continued to use the word triggered when referring to the superintendent. He was triggered, he was out of control. It seemed odd. We have had regular occasion to talk to many superintendents, and this one in particular. It's not his demeanor in our experience. And so we inquired further about what was going on. Why do you say he was triggered? The response we were given was, I think it's because he believes we're going to bring in a CEO. Did you have a question?
No, I'm just looking at the time.
Oh,
So I was just wondering if there's a way to ensure that we're able to get to the other sections as well. But if there, I'm trying to see exactly where we are on this to count slides.
Also, I think it's important to also hear from
Sure.
those who are here as well.
Yes, yes, and knowing that we've got quite a bit of obviously this was part of the report, but I think that the more substantive areas to cover have to do with the next two sections.
okay. So the last part of this was an audio.
She's saying.
Oh, I get it. This last part was an audio recording where the phrase hostile work environment was used in space for human resources was there.
This actually is something that I think we do want to make sure to draw your attention to, because obviously these things can be corrected. And so definitely, if there's any comment here before we.
Sure. So I'll try to quickly go through this.
Okay, thanks.
The April 2022 meeting agenda for community strategies caused the department to have some concern about the language on the agenda. We did not think it was specific enough in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. So we notified, sent an email to Epic. In fairness, I don't think they received it in time because the meeting was occurring just a short time later. And so they proceeded. Subsequently responded to the department saying, we understand, we won't engage in that, work to better the language on the agenda. And so in May of 2022, the May 11th agenda, we were told that there were two agendas for this meeting. One was posted in compliance. It was a personnel item. It said executive session for the purpose of discussing the superintendent, his evaluation, things like that. We were then told that a board member contacted the board clerk and directed that individual to remove that agenda, to remove the superintendent's name, and then repost that agenda. It's two violations. You can't have it. Oh, go ahead.
Did you find that that communication was directly from the board member to the clerk? Was the attorney involved in that?
Not that we know of.
So it's possible that whoever was involved just had an unawareness of the, is that correct?
Sure.
Okay.
unawareness of that, but having an obligation to know the requirements of the Open Meeting Act, having training, and then, we did send the email.
I'm assuming there was a June meeting. Are you aware, was it in compliance?
As I stand here, I don't know.
Is
I will
this,
say yes. Just
is
because
this
I
a
don't know.
piece that, in your opinion, this has been addressed to them? It sounds like from what you said, admitted that there may have been some issues and are working to rectify this piece.
Absolutely, yeah. And in talking with board members, one in particular, Mr. Long, I just happened to meet the other day, is very dedicated, very committed, engaged in process. And so a lot of this is process stuff. I think he's a fantastic board member.
This compared to what we
I know.
learned about Western Heights is like,
Oh, man.
Or
Yeah.
in the past where.
Maybe they can serve on another
We're
board.
in previous leadership on the board where it was more opaque, you didn't know what was happening.
Yeah.
That's out of compliance. So yeah, there's been improvement.
But do recall the Western Heights community members, the staff sending emails about the environment at the workplace. It's not all that. Step to attendance, get out of the governance section. Chapter 2, the requirement for student attendance. This was a result of legislation, House Bill 2905. Schools, statewide virtual charter schools, are to withdraw a student who is absent for 15 consecutive days and who are not on pace. Okay. Looking at the 2020-21 school year, you can see the numbers here. There was evidence, go ahead.
I'm sorry, on that requirement, that's for all schools, or is that specifically for virtual?
The
Or
latter.
is there any divergence as far as?
Yes. Yes. That requirement right there is for statewide virtual charter schools. For brick and mortar, it is 10 days.
Okay. That's what I thought.
The page, PAGE?
It's pace.
Oh, okay.
Pace.
I wanted to make
Mistake.
sure.
So the evidence, we saw 4,819 students with this pattern of 14 days absent, and all of a sudden present on the 15th day, and then absent 14 consecutive days after that.
And that's a pattern. So we saw that. It's based from an algorithm.
Yeah.
Did you
that
look
would
at,
keep a student who would normally have already been in any other setting. They would be withdrawn.
a couple of questions here. So the 4,819, are those the only students that had the 14 days absent? I guess, were there other students that were dropped on the 15th day? Or was it every student that was absent 14 days got that 15-day present?
I think I understand.
What you're saying.
I think I understand that as well. These are the students who had the 14-1-14 only and who were not dropped.
Do we know if there were students dropped?
They definitely dropped students. In fact, the internal auditor's report, former internal auditor said, you're dropping too many kids. I think we found the opposite.
Was this the only school year you looked at to see if
No.
this pattern exists?
No, we looked at the 2 years prior and there were 0 instances in each of the 2 years prior. And we know that this year, the data is not certified at this point, but we know that some of these patterns are continuing.
what is House Bill 2905?
Caroline, I might have to ask you, but for
Is that
purposes
is that
here,
the attendance thing?
or for
Yeah, where it changed from
And
15
when did that happen?
2020?
2 years ago.
That went into effect for this previous school year, I guess.
This 2021 year was the first year it was
Yeah.
affected.
The algorithm, so it appears,
So the algorithm
what your findings
responded-
is the algorithm was made to accommodate a statute and it just kind of went all Facebook on us and messed some stuff up.
Precisely it.
Use clinical terminology.
Yeah, I think the
Went
statement
all
of the report is,
Facebook.
it appears the algorithm was created as a result of House Bill 2905, and we see these patterns.
Second be.
Except that there's funding that goes with that. So that's
Right,
why
but
it's a
it's-
finding.
So did it go so far as to say that if not for this, those 4,819 students should have been dropped based on the
Say that again.
requirement. Based on the requirement in law, these 4,819 students, except for this 14.1 algorithm, should have been dropped.
I think that is the conclusion we reached, yes.
When do you think this algorithm was created?
Well, seeing that there were no instances before this school year. And then you see the
algorithm
jump,
was put in place to comply with the state law that
Which was the
passed.
2021 school year?
Yeah.
What you're
Correct.
The
suggesting?
law was
Finished in
passed in 2020.
Algorithm's been in place,
and so
like the algorithm that wasn't needed. Then you had to have it. The algorithm messed up.
it's also,
Well,
I think,
presumably you didn't have to have it. Like,
Yeah.
it's also important to note that the attendance requirements, there are three options. So I said that Senate Bill 244 in 2018. It gives three options to statewide virtual charter schools. I think Epic is going to a different option next year. As of this year, the option that they use is to measure attendance every quarter. So how many instructional activities did a student complete over the course of a quarter in the school year? And that bot, the algorithm, allocates those activities across that quarter. So in theory, a student is counted present on a day that there was no instructional activity completed, or the inverse could be true as well.
can I ask, I know this is, I believe this is outside the purview of this board and would really be more under the virtual charter school board, but are there best practices around how should virtual schools measure attendance? And is there, outside of this requirement, is any of that in statute? Are there any, kind of regulations that have been put out on that issue specifically that you're aware of?
Yes, to all of that.
And I have a follow-up question too. Sorry. Are you done?
I don't know that I got my answer, but.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish. Sorry, Brad.
I said yes.
Yes, and so the statute does give those three options. One of the other options is logging in. So there's a timestamp every time you log in. There are other options that exist and other best practices as options. Sure.
There was a regime change, very public one. What's the time frame on all of that?
So the
Epic went from a for-profit to a not-for-profit.
the regime change I think you're referring to was May 26th, 2021. So this is obviously before that.
However, the
And-
complaints you're referring to happened after.
They did.
Well, and can I ask about that? And maybe this is toward the end, but I'm really curious about the timeline of like whenever Epic was informed that this algorithm was found
Mhm.
and kind of what has happened since that has occurred, because it seems like, based on the timeline, that it seems clear that it was put in place prior to the current leadership.
Absolutely.
It sounds like it may continue to be happening. When was Epic made aware that this existed and kind of what has happened since then? And if you're going to get into that, sorry.
Nope, it's a great question. So Epic made the department aware through those interviews that occurred in May. That was when we learned of it,
May of 22.
May of 22. But Epic, I believe, would have known about this system prior to that, right? Because they entered into a contract, I believe. And then they would have known, I would hope, the work that was going on under that contract. But that might be a question better reserved for them.
You're not sure, you're just speculating.
Yeah, I would think based on principles of contracting and so forth, that you would have deliverables and whatnot in the contract. Just to illustrate, these are in the report as well. This is a look at a student's calendar. So those red days and circles are that student identified by their student testing number, days that student was absent. And so there's a day present. This is at 14/1/14. There's 14 absences after October 20th, and then present November 10th, and then absent, you get it.
That's one student.
Not many days of being present.
And just,
Sorry.
just to be, just, you know, also for, like the algorithm, the decisions around those contracts. I mean, obviously, it is, Epic has, the current board has been trying to navigate a whole systems change with change in original board members, let's say. But the other is, it is always going to be the responsibility of the school district to be in charge, to own, to understand, and then to authenticate that this is, and verify and validate this is accurate. So the responsibility is not on the department to alert them. And they did share, you know, that this is an algorithm. And I think that there was even the comment, it's a black box, like we can't get into it. This would be where we had third party, the ability with a subpoena could have gotten that unlocked as regulators.
And it's important to note,
But Epic certainly should have that. You know, obviously, they're certifying those results of that system.
that there may very well turn out to be nothing nefarious about this. We just don't know at this point. This is what the data show that we have at this time.
Well, that's what I was gonna ask, and I'll ask them too. Did you, as part of your investigation, look at that, let's say this student on October 20th, did they actually do any work?
You don't know because
There's no way to know that.
Yeah.
Because of the way attendance is put in.
But couldn't you go and see, like, did that student
go to the
actually
student
do
and
work
say-
that day?
To their
Yeah.
home?
We could go to the student and say, did you do work on October 20th of 2020?
Well,
But
not that. I assume the student would not know. But presumably if you're, and maybe I just don't understand the
Yeah.
workings of how student work is cataloged online in virtual schools, but I assume if a student logs into the system or does any work that is logged on that day. Now, this is saying like they were counted as doing work and it's just not clear if they actually did do work or not.
correct.
Okay.
And that definition of instructional activity is in statute. It's been amended recently. Under the old definition, a text message could count as an instructional activity.
Yeah.
But it should be documented.
But if that student submitted a paper on the 20th, or if
Yeah.
they did, you know, a work, I don't know, something on the 20th, like there would be a document
Right.
somewhere that proved they actually did some work on the 20th.
Yeah. In my mind, the better way, more accurate way to know for sure is to go like those other options with login timestamps, things like that.
And I appreciate the discussion.
It's probably something that Epic can.
Yes.
Okay, enrollment, same chapter 2. The regulations, state board adopted regulation requires a student to not be counted on a school's roster, i.e. not be counted for funding purposes in a brick and mortar setting until that student is in a seat in the school. That's the first day you can count that student. In a virtual setting, it is the first day the student completes an instructional activity. That was amended 2019, 2020 to include the instructional activity. So the pattern or the overall number we saw here was that there was an average gap of 8.5 days between a student was counted for funding purposes on Epic's roster to when they actually completed an instructional activity. Extrapolating that out, the evidence, the data show we have that added over 39,000 days that should not have counted.
So how did you know, tell me again, how did you know there was 8.5 day gap? Earlier you said you couldn't know if they'd done instruction. How did you know here?
We know that they're counted as present.
Okay, so it's attendance we're talking about, but not,
Difference.
but you said instructional activity at 8.5 days.
Instructional activity and attendance are synonymous here.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Okay,
So-
I appreciate that clarity because that was not what I understood you.
Yes, sir. So that would be in theory, completing an instructional activity.
And I
Okay.
guess I'm confused then, what's the
So these are two
14.1 versus 8, what's the
Two separate.
14 versus 8.5?
Two separate
Two
issues.
separate. One is attendance. The other is for funding and enrollment purposes. When you get to count a student for funding.
So like the start date, let's say with any other, let's just use contrast with brick and mortar. And correct me if I say this incorrectly, but you enroll and then you actually show up for class on a particular day. And that's the day you actually start your assignments, and that's the day the
Okay.
school begins receiving a funding trigger, if you will. And so in this setting, it should be the same. It should be that enrollment date and instruction date don't have a gap.
That's it. So those 39,000 days amount to about $780,000.
I'm afraid this is gonna be an ignorant question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Aren't kids, and I'm guessing it's different in virtual, but counted on October 1st, right? I mean, isn't that when the funding count is?
Yes, mostly. It could be, we go out on the second.
So I guess
That's
I don't
for
understand the
average.
enrollment
So that's for
piece.
average daily numbers.
Go ahead,
That's
Carolyn.
different than, go ahead, Carolyn.
I mean, I feel like I know this, but I'm confused.
Are we already finished?
I feel very confused
It's gonna be
right now.
tough.
I know.
So
That's
the
why it's-
October 1 counts take the count, a snapshot on that day for the weight purposes. So for special education, economically disadvantaged, et cetera. But the ADM is an average. And so we take
What's
that
ADM?
average daily membership. And so we take that over and we measure it on the first quarter statistical report. So it's two separate reports for two separate purposes. And so we actually take the ADM from the average of the first quarter. So it is counting from the
And it only
beginning.
counts from the start is what
Yes.
we're talking about.
Yes.
So like the first day of enrollment or first day of actually being present. Right, is the difference here.
Right.
And that first quarter statistical report is not always October 1.
So presumably though, this hurts them from an ADM standpoint, right? Because it starts after the day that they were enrolled versus the day that they actually did instructional activity.
I don't think that's correct.
We don't have to get in the weeds on it. I just am really confused.
Or in the mud,
Well,
or in the mud soup.
it's material
So
though.
membership is not attendance. Membership is essentially enrollment, your head count of the kids that are enrolled at the school on a given day. And that begins for the student on November 19th, or would begin the first day of school whenever. So they are enrolled
Right.
for purposes of average daily membership. There are separate funding sources that use average daily attendance, for example. But here in this case, they began receiving funding for purposes of average daily membership on whatever this day is, November 19th. But the statute says that they shouldn't have been receiving funding for that student until they did an instructional activity or were present.
Let me ask this
For
then.
virtual.
And
That's for virtual.
let's say brick and mortar. If I enroll my daughter in school, but then she doesn't show up until day 13 of school, does that school get the first 13 days in their ADM?
It's physical presence in the seat at the school.
Okay. And
So
then-
with other virtual schools, have you run the same numbers and what's their average? Is there an average gap with them? And if so, what is it?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I would hope not.
But they may use
It-
different.
but it
so
could be.
remember, They have
Correct, 'cause you
different
haven't done
It
it.
options.
shouldn't be.
But it could be.
Anything's
This,
possible.
this
Okay.
should not happen. This.
I understand. I'm just trying to be clear with
Yeah.
what Brad's saying though.
Yeah,
So-
but there are 7 now. 6 virtual, statewide virtuals.
I don't know. They've had recent applicants. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, and they have an option of which way they're measuring attendance. So
Is it appropriate for me to ask the question?
Whatever the board, I mean, no, Travis?
Yeah, not,
No.
not,
Okay,
not at this point.
That's okay.
Chapter 3.
Okay, can I ask one, sorry, one really quick question. So, because I'm guessing you're eventually gonna get to recommendations, right? Is the recommendation, whatever that amount was, to be paid back?
Not yet, because we don't know until we get into that algorithm and see how that was written.
And I guess that's my question on how confident are we in, it sounds like to me, it's unclear if what this algorithm is, where it lives, is it still going on? Like that piece of the investigation, is that still ongoing? Is that, I'm trying to understand like kind of how we have a report with recommendations where it sounds like that piece is still murky to me.
Okay, and if it sounds that way, I need to correct that because it is complete.
Okay.
Okay, so the recommendation is that we are going to turn it over to other agencies who have the ability to look into that further and make that final determination. But what we know is that this algorithm was used to certify under penalty of law that that data is correct. And the data that we looked at as certified data shows those numbers. And we know that it was continuing into this school year. It may not be next year. We know at this point in time it's being used, and
And that number was for the last school year.
that is correct. But the data for this year hasn't been certified yet. But
but must be by
what we
what
see
day?
in the system that's being reported does show that same thing.
And by what day is that to be certified? It's
It's in the
the,
next few days.
Yeah.
And so we're working in partnership with Epic. So when the data is certified, that affects all schools in the state. So if it's not certified, that's going to hold up potentially
right.
other things.
So what you're here to kind of answer part of your question on that.
Yes.
Any overpayment to Epic means an underpayment to the rest of the school districts in the state, okay? Because of our equalized, funding formula. And this is related to the previous fiscal year because this year's hasn't yet been finalized through that. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am.
But does it,
Thank you.
it sounds like, so just to clarify, for this school year, when this has all kind of come to light, it sounds like Epic is working with the department to try to get an accurate count by the certification date, which is very vastly appropriate.
Yes, I believe that to be correct. Yeah.
Because you've already
In fact,
said they brought it to your attention and admittedly said it was a black box they couldn't get into. So you guys are
Yeah,
working with
we-
them to get it resolved. Is that
we are,
correct?
And in
Okay.
fact, as recent as was that Tuesday, in the meeting we had with them, we discussed, you may have to, we're going to work with you all, and if we ask you to work with us to figure out a way that you can certify that, and not hold up other districts in the state, but make a mark of some sort that we know that you're
Gotcha.
protesting.
And
Okay,
there
good.
is a marked difference in previous working with Epic
Working
prior
relationship,
to the
yeah.
change.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Yep.
A big change
Thank you
in
for that.
May 26, 2020.
And even since the report was released this week, we've had several reach out. We want to work with you. We want to get together as early as next week.
Right.
Okay, so
Very
I
good.
hope that's positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very
Sounds
positive.
like it, yes.
Last chapter is the only slide on this. Okay. The allegation was that bonuses exceeded employment contracts, weren't approved by the board, and they weren't prorated. In our opinion, Epic has a different opinion. In our opinion and conclusion, all three of those are true. We notified Epic Community Strategies in November of 2020 that the board has to approve all financial transactions. You looked at board agendas, board packets, purchase orders. That started happening. Community Strategies responded in 2020 with a resolution directing the school to ensure all financial transactions are presented for approval to the board. It's a
So it's
fact.
clear that was their intention, or that they intended to do that,
And
right?
they responded to the State Department of Ed to say, you are correct, we will comply.
That was in April of 2020.
November of 2020. And then they started complying. They presented financials, payroll to the board every month. Every meeting, they were presented with that packet. We looked at it, compared the numbers that aligned. In April of 2021, just a few months later, that stopped. Payroll, if you look at the purchase order packet, at the top it says it excludes payroll. Cannot be any clearer than that. The problem here is in May, there's an email that went out that says, admin team, this has been a tough year. You guys have really pushed through. Appreciate it. You're going to be receiving your bonuses early.
An email from whom?
It came from the superintendent, but the communication was drafted by the former communications director, I believe. Assistant superintendent of communications, but I'm not sure what the title was, but that email, also important here, it says you will be awarded the full potential amount in your employment contract. Not anything more. It says you will get that 100% full amount.
And that was sent to all the administration.
Correct.
Not the teachers.
No,
Yeah.
they're awarded, their bonus structure is different.
Yeah, so I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, that's right. So May 26th, back yesterday, the day before, I went back, found the video, the Facebook video of the meeting on May 26th, because in our meeting earlier this week, there was a dispute about what actually was approved at the May meeting. Because they went into executive session, the agenda says executive session to discuss negotiations with administrative personnel, including the superintendent and internal auditor. And then they go into executive session. Earlier this week, we were told, well, the board in executive session approved those bonuses. It's different than what we were told in our notes comparing all along. So I went back once again, having done it already, and found the video of that meeting. Coming out of executive session, the statement, this is a direct quote, is this is an important item, this executive session item. We need to take up the renewal of our administrative contracts for the upcoming school year. Did not say anything about bonuses that were earned that year. That's on video. There's no evidence other than recent statements that the board approved those bonuses. That's problematic. It's also problematic because comparing the employment agreements, certain employees were not paid that 100% of what was in the employment contract. They were paid over those amounts.
Is the email that was sent in here? I can't remember.
The May 19th, yes. Overages on the, sorry, Trent, I lied. Didn't mean to. The overages on the employment contracts total $800,000, just roughly over that. The proration, we've been told recently that it was not just one employee who was paid an amount that wasn't prorated, but the one that we did know about and saw evidence of, that employee was paid 600% more than what that individual should have been paid based on the proration policy in the employment agreement.
What role did that individual have?
Head of finance, which is one of the recommendations that we have, is to separate payroll functions. Right now, it's run through one department, the financial department. I think it's the best practice to separate that across departments, maybe human resources, maybe some of this they can figure out at the board level, school level. But in the end, the recommendation in the report, not today, clear, no action requested today, but in a meeting that the state board placed Epic on probation. As a result, here's a standard for probation.
So I have a question about the payments. So is it that the payments didn't jive with the contract or just that they weren't approved by the board?
Both.
So how did they not comply with the contract, with the employees were contracted?
That's a great question. The employment contracts were never approved by the board.
And then, I don't know, maybe it's just something from a different world, but I mean, as management, I mean, there's no such thing as like management just, hey, good job here. Like,
No,
They're only allowed to
Not
pay
with the
with the
state.
contract.
not with tax dollars. I mean, it has to go through certain,
I understand the board approval part. That's all.
And if they had wanted to give bonuses above and beyond the contract, they could have done that if the board had approved it.
That is correct. Yeah, and given a reason for why that was done. That's correct. The board can deviate from their policies if they so choose to an extent, but that would be allowable. Thank you. That's it. Like, yeah, certainly.
Like to hear from-
Bio break.
do you want to give?
Yeah.
I don't want,
Stand over here under.
no. All right, how about, just to give everyone a chance to take one little small break before you start so that there's not a disruption. And let's take a 10-minute break. Let's see, that would mean we would be back at 1 o'clock. All right.
The time to run and get a pizza.